Hello, this is Freedom First. My name is Jeffrey Tucker, and I write for the epochTimes. You've undoubtedly heard about what happened at the Los Angeles Times recently. The paper has fired 100 employees. That's a substantial amount of their staff. In many ways, gutted major parts of their newsroom in cost-cutting measures because the paper was, quite frankly, losing, well, dramatic amounts of money. It's a surprising and I would say somewhat satisfying thing for many people who've been watching this newspaper for many years. It's the largest one in California and it's a very serious newspaper in the country. And now suddenly we find ourselves with dramatic cost-cutting measures. The Guild is very upset. There's ongoing negotiations. It's a big deal, made the national news. Of course, you know, economics and of the media represents in many ways a hard wall, and all the wishes in the world are not going to overcome the problems that come with double entry bookkeeping and accounting. They just couldn't make it work with their present staff. Now, this is an interesting little story, but it's one of many such stories that's going on with the corporate media right now. Something dramatic happened to Sports Illustrated. They effectively fired their entire staff just without any real notice, almost completely shut down. They're looking for a buyer right now, but it seems to be gone. Many other cuts are taking place at other places. Major reporters and staff at large newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are getting concerned that they're going to be cut too. We're no doubt living through a time of tremendous upheaval in how it is that we get our news, where the facts come from, and how we interpret that. And what seems to be happening, essentially, is that the old line corporate media's hold over the public mind is evaporating at a very dramatic. Of course, this dates back some time, but things have changed really more dramatically over the last 4 years. I have my own theories about what's going on here. If you think back to what I consider the worst times of our lives, which was the year 2020 and 2021, under the lockdowns for COVID, where we were entirely dependent upon the national media. The national media was heavily censored and unified in many ways on supporting all of the lockdown policies that were being imposed by the governors and by the bureaucracies against the American people, so that we couldn't go to church, the schools were closed, people that were advocating for opening the schools were censored, many were demonetized from YouTube, Google was preventing searches for any dissenting opinions at this time. It was a very strange time because you had some sense, and you remember these days probably, that everything seemed to be going kind of crazy, and yet you felt really alone in your views. I mean, you were thinking things like, wait, is it really this bad? Is this lockdown really helping? Don't we know for sure that this virus is mainly producing medically significant outcomes for people that were elderly and infirm? I mean, is it really true that we need to lock down the whole population? This went on for a very long time, but then the shot mandates came along, and the same media called for the cancellation of holidays and said you couldn't travel, was suddenly telling you that unless you got the vaccine, you were killing people and you were public enemy number one. In fact, according to the President Biden himself, you were causing the pandemic to be prolonged. And, you know, the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and all the corporate TV media and everything echoed those same opinions. It was very strange times. And we felt, many people just felt completely alone, especially the dissidents. We didn't realize it at the time. But the dissidents on this whole subject were being dramatically censored. A good example of that is social media. Now, early on, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, later called Meta, volunteered, wrote a note to Fauci and said, whatever you want, I'll give you. Well, CDC and NIH wanted censorship. Zuckerberg gave it to them. So you got your account deleted, you got throttled, you got shouted down. Any post that related to a subject of Fauci's concern got slapped with a go to the CDC label instead. And it was throughout the whole of social media. I mentioned YouTube and Google, but this affected LinkedIn. It affected obviously Instagram, which is owned by Facebook's company Meta. So it affected everything. It was very strange. It was like this war, not only on political dissent, but also even on questioning the science. And that's what we were told. We're all unscientific. Of course, Los Angeles Times was part of this. Now, when we woke up from that disaster and we looked back for the media to try to figure out how can we restore trust, what we've seen is an aggressively partisan media that seems to be taken over largely by extremist woke style philosophy, treating anybody who voted for Trump, anybody who just wants their freedom and rights back, they're treated as like a public enemy, like you don't belong here. You're not part of the mainstream of American life. And a lot of us sort of believed it for a while, but over time, we found out just how much the system was manipulated through aggressive censorship. That censorship took the form of government agencies working directly with social media, major media companies, TV broadcasters, in-print newspapers. Every single company was involved in this. We have vast amounts of documentation to this effect. It's shocking because, you might think this violates the First Amendment. And a lot of people believe that it violates the First Amendment. And that's, in litigation right now. Several courts have agreed and said the government can't do through third-party intermediaries what it's not legal to do itself. You can't just get around the First Amendment by Fauci giving a call to the editor of the Los Angeles Times and say, you should say this, or calling up Twitter and telling the CEO, you've got to take this down. It doesn't work that way. That's not the way a free economy works. So here we are 4 years later, and lots of things have come out. One of the most interesting aspects of this whole unfolding of the breakdown of mainstream corporate media is taking place at Twitter, now known as X. So when Elon Musk bought the platform, he got access to not only all the files, which he released in the Twitter files that came out, and the Epoch Times has been all over those things for years reporting it, but there was also a great deal of code that he was in charge of ripping out. It took months to get rid of it. Twitter had this thing called the Trust and Safety Team that was in charge of deleting accounts of dissidents, of de-throttling accounts, of eliminating certain accounts from being searched on the platform. Elon's taken most of that out as best he possibly can while attempting to comply with the law. And in many ways, God bless him for it. I mean, he's just, I don't know what we would have done without him. He re-enabled lots of new accounts, and now the place is more active than ever. It has more users than ever. It's a more wonderful platform than it's ever been. Still not making money. That's always a great challenge. But at least it's not heavily censored. There are other aspects to the story too. In various interviews, he's talked very frankly about the world he discovered when he took over Twitter. What he said was that there were government employees that were, or former FBI and present FBI employees, that were embedded throughout the entire corporate structure, and that the Trust and Safety Team was working directly with government agents at all levels, and that the censorship machinery that he found and eventually dismantled was very, very, very bad. And one interview asked him, just how bad it was. And his response was, imagine the worst thing you can possibly think of, the most extreme conspiracy you can think of. And that is true, and even worse. That's what he said. So I just can't even imagine. After Elon took took over, it was a delight for me personally, of course, because I was able to get access to opinions and views and news that I didn't previously have access to. I mean, epochtimes for a long time was going it alone. You know, they have this thing called Spaces at Twitter, and I kind of briefly fell in love with it. I said, I'm going to try out Spaces and see what it's like. Well, it's interesting. And I was startled because you click on a button and suddenly you hear people just talking freely with each other without censorship in real time. I remember what a fresh feeling that was. Like, wow, it's been years since I feel as if I've heard honest and frank discussions uncensored between people in real time. And for a while there, it was very interesting. You could click on, at least in my case, I would open up a space and start talking, and before you know it, there were several hundred people that would show up. And I organized several spaces, and we had thousands, many thousands of people listening at the same time. Well, one day, my notifications came up, and there was a notification for a spaces being held by the New York Times. I thought, well, that's interesting. Let's see what they have to say. Well, I clicked on it. It was some ridiculous, irrelevant thing about some marginalized group that they're paddling on, about which nobody cares. And I was startled to see that there were only 6 people. There were like 6, maybe 12, but no more than that, listening to the New York Times at a platform with tens of millions of users. The New York Times itself has millions of followers, and yet they couldn't get anybody to show up to their program. And I guess ever since I experienced that, I've come to a realization. And it has to do with the way in which the public mind, our perceptions of the opinions around us, have been wildly distorted over the last 4 years during this period of censorship. We came to believe that we're the crazy ones, we're the radicals, we're the dissidents. Nobody agrees with us. My goodness, just turn on the TV. Look at what the newspapers are saying. Look at what Facebook is saying. You're not in the mainstream. I began to realize that this was all an illusion. That actually the opposition to this sort of extreme partisan, woke, pro-lockdown, hard anti-Trump views, extreme anti-Trump views, were really a minority. It's just that all the manipulation of the system that was taking place was giving a distorted picture of this. And you think about what it must have been like during those days. I'm talking about from 2020 when all this stuff began, all the way until Musk took over. What it must have been like for the so-called trust and safety team. I mean, their job is to inspire engagement on the platform, to get new users, to give voice, to people, to allow some people to reach other people. That's the idea of social media. Where their job was, in effect, to prevent that from happening. For what percentage of users? A third? A half? Half the users? 2/3? Is it 90%? We don't actually know. But that's the job they're doing. They're actively ruining the mission and purpose of an entire company, and no one knew it. They kept it a secret, they kept it under wraps, and nobody was able to discover that until the entire company fell in different hands. And Elon looked in the engine room and found himself completely shocked. Well, ever since then, things have been unfolding gradually. And our perceptions of the world around us have dramatically changed. Just a quick story about that. You would think that the mainstream media might have pivoted by now and recognized, well, maybe we need to stop demonizing Trump voters and views that are different from ours. Maybe the people that didn't want the vaccine had a point, and we should listen to that point of view. Maybe the government made some huge errors during COVID and should lock down everybody when only a thin number of people needed protection. Maybe we should listen to alternative points of view on matters of science. You would think they would have pivoted by now. But the problem is, I don't yet see any real evidence of any serious change. They just keep burrowing down. And I'll just give you an example. I don't listen to National Public Radio very much. In fact, I think I did a hard shutdown of that thing many years ago. But every once in a while, I like to see what's going on. And I was in the car the other day and I turned it on. And a lady was, and it doesn't matter who it was or what the show was, it's all the same, was explaining why people were voting for Donald Trump. And she began back in the 1980s, and she told the tall tale about how the Republicans were courting white voters as a means for cutting the welfare state, and explaining that they're being robbed by minorities, which is not true. I knew that wasn't true. This is a conventional tall tale you hear all the time. And then she went further. She said, well, and then they began to court Christians under the idea that their country is being profaned, and then gradually the party began to welcome Christian nationalism. Well, you hear this phrase Christian nationalism. I'm not even entirely sure what that means, really. But to her, what it meant was basically favoring theocracy. Really? We've got theocrats in the Republican Party are becoming dominant? Really? And then she went on. And she said, and so after all these years, once Donald Trump got elected in 2016, they've sold the same package of goods to blue-collar workers who are resentful of jobs being shipped overseas. And so they are now part of this great apparatus of, and then she literally said this, she said, Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and then she even added a point on it that there's more and more talk of how dictatorship is preferable to democracy. Now, at that point, I just couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand it anymore. So I just turned it off. I thought, how is it that you can market this level of what seems to be psychopathology in the guise of punditry and expertise? And who is actually listening to this? Much less, who is believing this stuff? I don't know. I mean, college professors, probably, super privileged professional managerial class elites educated in Ivy universities, they don't know any better and they believe anything and everything. But it's just, quite frankly, as I put it in an article today, completely bonkers. It's just the unwillingness of the mainstream corporate press to question their entire worldview and to take seriously the Trump movement is a grave failing that I submit to you is now coming home to roost in the form of accounting that is unsustainable for vast numbers of these venues. These days, there are options. We know this. There are alternative video platforms, alternative social media platforms, alternative newspapers. The platform called Substack is giving voice to writers. There have been tremendous pressures to shut them down, but so far they have not succeeded. So you can get your news in other ways. Part of the rap on the alternative press is that it's only a minority. It's just a handful of people, and it doesn't really matter. What really matters is the New York Times, and so on and so on. I don't believe that anymore. I think that's another bill of goods we've been sold. This is what they tell us to make us feel as if we're irrelevant, we don't matter, that our views are not welcome in polite company, you better shape up and just do what the New York Times tells you. My sense is that those days are, if not done, they're in the last days of that outlook. The mainstream press is just not competing with the alternative press. So we're living in times of tremendous upheaval. It's very exciting too. Let me conclude with a thought on this, because I have several friends who work and, very nice positions in these places. It's not that they believe in the propaganda and the smears and the lies and the weird ideological contortions they're engaged in. They don't believe in that any more than reporters who worked for Pravda in the 1970s were communists or thought that, I don't know, Leonid Brezhnev was a great, dictator. They don't believe that. It's just a job for them. So they talk to me and tell me about it. Everybody at the New York Times reads very carefully posts at X. They read the Epoch Times. They subscribe to Substack. They read Substack. They follow everything that's going on because they need the news too. They're terrified of it. They're terrified of it institutionally, but they're warm and drawn to the views that are out there because they make more sense. They help explain the world better than their own papers, and they know it. So that is a very interesting revelation to me. My own perspective on this is that we're going to see a dramatic crack up of the old press. And one of the reasons is that very tight and close relationship that the media has with government. They sought it out, they cultivated it, and they indulged it for years. Now you might ask yourself the question, if you're in a media company, if you're the press, wouldn't you rally around the freedom to speak, like the First Amendment, and then grant that to everybody else? The answer is not necessarily. If you can reach for tools of censorship and work tightly with government agencies to shut down the competition, what are you doing? You're prolonging your institutional life. But I submit to you that this is not only wrong, it's not only immoral, it not only violates the First Amendment, but it's not going to work. It's an act of desperation. So, my friends, support the alternative media. Your voice does matter. We are making a difference. We're at a crucial time in American history. A lot of it comes down to what people believe about their country, about the world, about themselves, about their communities. That is informed very heavily by the people who are feeding the public mind. As a dissident, as somebody who's curious about the truth, who wants to have a realistic understanding of the world around them, as somebody who cares about the country, by consuming and supporting alternative media, you are doing a great thing for the country, for the future of freedom itself. Thank you very much for listening. Always remember, put freedom first. I'm Jeffrey Tucker.